let's solve an easy passage. It's available in the description. Try it first before proceeding with the video. Let's begin. Every loan has a lender and a borrower. Both voluntarily engage in the transaction. So if we have to decide the topic just from this sentence, then I would say it would revolve around loan, lending and borrowing. If the loan goes bad, there is at least a prima facie case that the lender is as guilty as the borrower. Prima facie means based on first impression. In fact, since lenders are supposed to be sophisticated in risk analysis and in making judgments about a reasonable debt burden, they should perhaps bear even more culpability. Author is talking about a bad loan. Bad loan means that the borrower is unable to repay its debt. Further, author is saying that both lender and borrower are responsible for a bad debt. In fact, lender is more responsible because his judgment was wrong in giving the loan. Culpability means responsibility for a fault, and this can also be understood from the context. Does it make a difference if we say there is over lending rather than over borrowing? So the first para ended by saying that lender is more responsible for a bad loan. Now, this question is giving a hint that this paragraph is going to explain why over lending is the main problem and not over borrowing. The difference in where we see the problem affects where we seek the solution. Is the problem more on the side of the lenders, that they are not exercising due diligence in judging who is creditworthy, or on the borrowers being profligate and irresponsible? Profligate means extravagant or wasteful in the use of resources. In fact, profligate and irresponsible are somewhat synonym. You can also skip this word and consider borrower as irresponsible. If we consider the problem to be over borrowing, then we naturally think of making it more difficult for borrowers to discharge their debts. On the contrary, if the problem is over lending, we focus on strengthening incentives for lenders to exercise due diligence. Contrast word on the contrary is showing the two cases, over lending and over borrowing, and how it is lenders' fault both the time. Most of the time, the main idea of the passage can be guessed by reading the first two paragraphs only. So at this point, if I am asked what the main idea would be, I will say over lending causes loan default problem. The political economy of over borrowing is easy to understand. The current borrowing government benefits and later governments have to deal with the consequences. So it started with general discussion on lender and borrower, and now this para is talking about a specific segment, political economy. A shift from general to specific that you should always notice. But why have sophisticated profit maximizing lenders so often overlend? Lenders encourage indebtedness because it is profitable. Developing country governments are sometimes even pressured to overborrow. There may be kickbacks in loans or even to be influenced by Western businessmen and financiers. They wine and dine those responsible for borrowing as they sell their loan packages and tell them why this is good time to borrow, why their particular package is attractive, why this is the right time to restructure debt. Countries that are not sure that borrowing is worth the risk are told how important it is to establish a credit rating. Borrow even if you really don't need the money. Now, after the cause and effect keyword because, author is citing reasons for why lenders overlend. Because it is profitable. Western financiers influence developing countries to borrow money. How this is profitable for them will be explained further. Passage says, excessive borrowing increases the chance of a crisis, and the cost of a crisis are borne not just by the lenders but by all of society. In recent years, IMF programs may have resulted in significant further distortions in lenders' incentives. When crisis occurred, the IMF lent money in what was called a bailout. But the money was not really a bailout for the country, it was a bailout for Western banks. So in order to explain how overlending is profitable, author is first explaining how loan gets repaid by those who cannot. IMF pays for countries that cannot pay their loan. So Western banks get their money back through the bailout. In both East Asia and Latin America, bailouts provided money to repay foreign creditors, thus absolving creditors from having to bear the cost of their mistaken lending. In some instances, governments even assumed private liabilities, effectively socializing private risk. The creditors were left off the hook. A few examples to support how IMF helped creditors. But the IMF money wasn't gift, just another loan, and the developing country was left to pay the bill. In effect, the poor country's taxpayers paid for rich countries' lending mistakes. You can see the cause and effect keyword in effect here. The cause was IMF bailing out defaulter countries, and the effect is the country now is a borrower from IMF, and this in turn brings the loan onto the country's taxpayers. The bailouts give rise to the famous moral hazard problem. Moral hazard arises when a party does not bear all the risk associated with his action and as a result does not do everything he can to avoid risk. The term originates in the insurance literature. It was deemed immoral for an individual to take less care in preventing a fire simply because he had insurance coverage. It is of course simply a matter of incentives. Those with insurance may not set their houses on fire deliberately, but their incentive to avoid a fire is still weakened. With loans, the risk is default. With all of its consequences, lenders can reduce that risk simply by lending less. If they perceive a high likelihood of a bailout, they lend money more than they otherwise would. Here author introduced new term moral hazard, then explains what it is with example of insurance industry. That people may not do their best in avoiding risk if they don't solely bear all the risk. Same analogy is with lenders. They would lend high carelessly as they know that a bailout would cover their risk eventually. Lending markets are also characterized by, in the famous words of former chairman of the US Federal Reserve Alan Greenspan, irrational exuberance as well as irrational pessimism. Lenders rush into a market in a mood of optimism and rush out when the mood changes. Markets move in fads and fashions, and it is hard to resist joining the latest fad. If only one firm were affected by a mood of irrational optimism, it would have to bear the cost of its mistake. But when large numbers share the mood in a fad, there are macroeconomic consequences potentially affecting everyone in the country. We can skip the example data in the last para. Reference of US Federal Reserve is not important. However, the idea which author is trying to say is important, that in market there is a sudden exuberance, or in simple words, there is a sudden excitement and every lender jumps in the rat race. And when it turns out to be a mistake or bad collective lending, then whole countries suffer. So to summarize, the passage analyzes the drawbacks of overlending to nations and subsequent bailout by IMF lending programs, and the ultimate implications of the above on country's economy. Let's solve the questions. The author is trying to find the underlying cause of financial crisis in the economy, underdevelopment in the developing world, bargaining power asymmetry between lenders and borrowers, inequalities in the world economy. The passage is about economy, so we can reject option B as it is not related. Option 3 is just one of the sub-ideas of the passage. Out of option 4 and 1, we would pick option 1, as author has tried to find the cause of financial crisis in the economy due to bad lending. The moral hazard arises because now author has explained moral hazard by giving example of insurance industry. Let's see the options. The insured take less precaution to avoid a risk because the risk is covered by insurance. The insured take less precaution to avoid risk because he is unaware about the risk. The insured take less precaution to avoid risk because he tends to benefit from the risk. The amount spent on insurance is seen as a waste because the risk is unlikely or minimum. This is a direct question. Option 1 is correct and is stated directly in the passage where it talks about moral hazard. Fifth para, second sentence. Moral hazard arises because the insured take less precaution to avoid a risk because the risk is covered by insurance. Next question. According to the author, the IMF bailouts for the countries in crisis have been in effect. The bailout for the governments of the borrowing countries, for the banks in the borrowing countries, for the leading foreign banks, or for the governments of the countries of the creditors. Passage has stated that IMF bailout is like blessing in disguise for Western or foreign banks, as IMF bails them out from their non-performing loans. Hence, option C is correct. Next question. The author believes that the cost of the crisis is ultimately borne by the leading banks, IMF, taxpayers of the borrowing country, or the rich countries. This is also a direct question. You can see in the passage that author believes the cost of crisis is ultimately borne by the taxpayer. Hence, correct option is option 3. Fourth para, last sentence. See here, it's written directly. With this, we have completed all the questions. Look at the questions again. Usually, questions starting with according to the fifth para or according to the author or what does author mean by this term, each questions are direct. Such questions are direct questions and are easiest of the lot. In fact, all the questions in this passage were direct. And even the passage was quite easy to understand. There will always be such a passage in your exam. So for verbal ability section, it boils down to selection of the correct passage. My advice is to always scan through the question paper first, look for the passage or topic you are comfortable with, check how many questions are there in the passage, is it a big passage or a small passage. Consider all these aspects and take decision accordingly. Thank you.